A Navy helicopter descending onto a hospital rooftop. Federal override of a medical suspension. One surgeon the military refused to let stay retired. For more stories like this, subscribe to Emergency Heroes Stories. The afternoon light through Dr. Hargrove's office window made the dust particles visible in the air between them. Avery Walsh stood with her arms loose at her sides, shoulders square, eyes level. She'd been standing there for 3 minutes while Hargrove read through incident reports. His reading glasses perched low on his nose, his jaw working silently as he processed each page. "Dr. Walsh," he finally looked up. "This is the 3rd time in 6 weeks you've deviated from established protocol." She didn't respond, didn't move. "You performed an emergency thoracotomy in the ER without cardiothoracic backup present, without consulting the on-call attending, without authorization from anyone in the surgical chain of command." "The patient had cardiac tamponade," Avery said. Her voice was quiet, measured. "Waiting for backup would have taken 12 minutes. He had 3, maybe 4. That assessment is not yours to make." Hargrove set the papers down with deliberate care. "You're an ER attending, not a trauma surgeon. We have protocols precisely to prevent unauthorized procedures. He's alive. That's not the point." "Then what is?" The question hung in the air. Hargrove removed his glasses, set them on the desk between the incident reports and his coffee mug, a gift from some pharmaceutical company with a slogan about innovation printed on the side. "The point, Dr. Walsh, is that hospitals operate on structure, on hierarchy, on clearly defined roles and responsibilities. When you ignore that structure, you create liability. You put the institution at risk." Avery's right hand moved almost unconsciously to her left forearm, fingers brushing the fabric of her sleeve where it covered the edge of something beneath. A mark. Ink. She caught herself and stopped. "Your surgical privileges are suspended effective immediately," Hargrove continued. 2 weeks, pending administrative review. You'll work clinical shifts only. No procedures beyond basic suturing and standard ER interventions." She nodded once. Clean, economical. No argument. No protest. "Do you have anything to say?" "No, sir." Hargrove frowned slightly, as if her compliance disappointed him more than resistance would have. He'd expected her to fight. They always did. The young attendings with something to prove. The ones who thought rules didn't apply to them because they were right, because they were skilled, because the patient lived. "You're dismissed." Avery turned and walked out. Her movements were efficient, controlled. She didn't slam the door. Didn't let her expression change until she was 3 steps down the hallway, out of sight, where her jaw tightened just slightly before relaxing again into professional neutrality. The locker room was empty when she reached it. 3rd shift hadn't started yet. 2nd shift was still on the floor. She opened her locker, the metal door swinging with a faint creak, and pulled her jacket from the hook inside. As she slipped it on, the sleeve rode up her left forearm. The tattoo was small, discreet, easily hidden. A caduceus wrapped around an anchor, rendered in fine black linework. Beneath it, numbers. A date maybe, or coordinates. "Dr. Walsh?" Avery turned. Dr. Lena Okoye stood in the doorway, still in scrubs, a tablet tucked under one arm. 27 years old, 2nd-year resident. Sharp as broken glass and twice as careful with her questions. "Lena." "I heard." Lena stepped inside, letting the door close behind her. "About the suspension." "News travels fast. It was the right call. What you did. Everyone knows it." Avery zipped her jacket. "Doesn't matter now." "It does matter. That patient is alive because you didn't wait, because you saw what needed to happen and you made it happen. And now I'm off the surgical board for 2 weeks." Avery closed her locker. The sound echoed in the empty room. "That's how it works." Lena was quiet for a moment, watching her. Then her eyes dropped to where Avery's sleeve had ridden up again, exposing the edge of the tattoo. "That's military," Lena said. Not a question. An observation. Avery glanced down, then pulled the sleeve into place. "Long time ago." "Navy?" "Yeah." "How long?" "Does it matter?" Lena studied her face, reading the deflection, the careful walls. She was good at that, reading people. It made her a better resident than most. Better than her technical skills alone would account for. "No," Lena said finally. "I guess it doesn't." Avery picked up her bag from the bench. "I'll see you in 2 weeks. Walsh." She stopped at the door. "Whatever you did before," Lena said. "Whatever made you that good with your hands, That fast with decisions under pressure like that. Maybe Hargrove needs to know about it. He knows what he needs to know. Does he? Avery looked back at her. For just a second, something flickered in her expression. Something old and tired and carefully buried. Take care, Lena. She left. The hallway outside was fluorescent bright, sterile white walls and linoleum floors polished to a dull shine. Nurses moved past, pushing medication carts. An orderly guided a patient in a wheelchair toward radiology. The hospital continued its rhythm, its mechanical pulse of crisis and recovery and endless documentation. Avery walked through it like water, present but untouched. Outside, the parking lot stretched under a gray coastal sky. The smell of salt air mixed with exhaust and the faint antiseptic scent that clung to everyone who spent their days inside hospitals. She found her car, a 10-year-old sedan with Reimer spots on the front fender, and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. Her hands rested on the steering wheel. Steady, no tremor. She'd broken protocol. She knew it when she made the first incision. Knew it when she cracked the chest and reached inside to release the pressure compressing the heart. Knew it when she heard the monitor stabilize and saw the color return to the patient's face and felt the entire ER go silent with the weight of what she'd just done. And she'd do it again. That was the problem Hargrove couldn't articulate, the thing that made her dangerous in his carefully structured world. She would always choose the patient over the protocol, always trust her hands over the hierarchy, always act when action was required. Regardless of who gave permission, she started the car. If you want to see how one suspended doctor becomes the only person who can save a dozen lives in a single night, make sure you subscribe. Comment below and tell us, have you ever been punished for doing the right thing? Because what happens next will change everything Avery Walsh thought she'd left behind. Friday morning arrived cold and gray. The kind of coastal dawn where fog rolled in thick off the Pacific and turned the world into something distant and muffled. Avery ran along the beach, her breath steady and rhythmic, feet hitting wet sand in an even cadence that matched her pulse. 5 miles every morning. Had been for years, through deployments and transfers, and the quiet months after she'd resigned her commission and tried to become someone else. The ocean stretched infinite to her left. Dark water merging with darker sky. To her right, beach grass bent in the wind. She ran alone, always alone. Her mind was quiet during these runs, emptied of everything except the physical sensation of movement, the burn in her legs, the salt air filling her lungs. It was the only time she didn't think about operating rooms or patient charts or the specific weight of a scalpel in her hand. By the time she returned to her apartment, the sun had started burning through the fog. She showered, dressed in civilian clothes, jeans and a sweater, made coffee she didn't drink. The suspension meant freedom she hadn't asked for and didn't want. 2 weeks of mornings like this, unstructured and purposeless. She sat by the window with a surgical journal open on her lap, not reading it, just looking at the diagrams of vascular repairs and thoracic approaches. Her fingers traced the illustrations absently. The memory arrived without warning, the way they always did, sudden and complete. The deck of the USS Mercy, hospital ship stationed off the coast of a country she couldn't name in official reports. The smell of salt water mixing with disinfectant and blood. Her hands inside a chest cavity, working by feel as much as sight. Helicopter rotors thundering overhead, bringing in another wave of casualties. Someone shouting about incoming. Someone else calling for more O-negative. The patient's heart, visible beneath her gloved fingers, beating against her palm like a trapped bird. She blinked. The memory dissolved. She was in her apartment, the journal still open, coffee growing cold on the table beside her. Her phone sat silent next to the mug. Across town, St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital was drowning. The multi-vehicle pileup had happened at dawn on the coastal highway. 18 cars and 2 semi-trucks in a chain reaction collision caused by black ice and fog and the particular kind of bad luck that turns a commute into catastrophe. The first ambulances had arrived at 6:45. They were still coming. Dr. Hargrove stood in the center of the ER, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, directing residents and nurses with the controlled urgency of someone managing a disaster by sheer force of organizational will. Trauma bays were full. Overflow patients lined the hallways. The air smelled like blood and burnt coffee and fear. "I need imaging on the patient in Bay 3, he called to a passing resident. "And someone find out why the CT scanner is still down." Lena Okoye moved between patients, checking vitals, updating charts, her mind working through triage priorities faster than her hands could document them. She passed another resident, a first-year, named Cooper, who looked on the edge of panic. "If Walsh were here," Lena muttered to him, "she'd have triaged this entire scene in 2 minutes." Cooper nodded, too overwhelmed to respond. Hargrove overheard, said nothing, but his jaw tightened slightly, and he turned back to the patient in front of him with something that might have been frustration or might have been regret. 40 miles north, Naval Air Station Rainier occupied a stretch of coastline that had been federal property since World War II. Hangars and administrative buildings, a small runway, a deep-water dock where destroyers and support vessels came for maintenance and resupply. It was a quiet posting, the kind of assignment sailors called a vacation compared to deployment overseas. Until the explosion. The training exercise had been routine. Live fire drills, damage control practice, the kind of repetitive procedures that kept crews sharp during peacetime. But something had failed, a containment valve, an electrical short. The specific technical cause would be determined later by investigators. What mattered now was the fireball that had torn through the lower deck of the destroyer, the shrapnel that had turned steel into fragments, the 12 sailors who'd been in the compartment when it happened. The base hospital was small, designed for routine care and minor emergencies. It had 2 operating rooms and a staff trained for peacetime medicine. This was not peacetime medicine. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reeves stood in the base hospital corridor, radio in hand, listening to the desperate traffic between the trauma teams and regional command. He was 41, 20 years in the Navy, split his time between the base and civilian liaison work at St. Catharines. He knew both worlds, military and civilian, and he knew when those worlds were about to collide. "We need a trauma surgeon with combat vascular experience," the voice on the radio said, crackling with static and urgency. "We have shrapnel near major vessels. Base hospital can't handle the volume. Repeat, we need immediate surgical support." Marcus's mind went immediately to one person, a face he'd seen months ago in the St. Catharines ER, a face that had seemed familiar in a way he couldn't place until now. Dr. Avery Walsh. He'd served on the Mercy 5 years ago, a deployment he barely remembered except for the intensity of it, the constant flow of casualties. The surgical teams working 20-hour shifts. He'd been a junior corpsman then, mostly assisting with post-op care, but he remembered the surgeons, remembered one in particular, a lieutenant commander who moved through the operating rooms like precision itself, quiet and fast and utterly unshakable. He pulled out his personal phone and dialed St. Catharines. Back at the hospital, Lena's phone buzzed. She stepped away from the patient she was monitoring and answered. "Dr. Okoye." "Lena, it's Marcus. Is Dr. Walsh still suspended?" "Yeah, why?" "Because the Navy just scrambled a helicopter for her." Lena froze. Around her, the ER continued its chaos. But she'd stopped hearing it. "What are you talking about?" "Explosion at the naval base. Multiple critical casualties. They're asking for a combat trauma surgeon." His voice dropped slightly. I knew I recognized her. Lieutenant Commander Avery Walsh. She was on the Mercy with me. One of the best trauma surgeons in the fleet. Lena's mind raced. The tattoo. The way Walsh moved during procedures. The absolute calm, under pressure that no civilian training fully explained. "Where is she now?" "I don't know, but if the Navy's looking for her, they'll find her." Lena ended the call. She stood in the middle of the ER, surrounded by controlled chaos, and pulled up a search on her phone. It took 30 seconds to find the military database photo. Lieutenant Commander Avery Walsh, MD, U.S. Navy Medical Corps. Dress whites, younger face, expression more open than the carefully neutral mask she wore now. Commendations listed, deployments listed, specialty training in combat trauma and vascular surgery. The woman who'd just been suspended for unauthorized procedures was decorated military surgeon who'd operated in war zones. Lena looked up. Across the ER, Hargrove was suturing a laceration. His movements competent but slow compared to what she'd seen Walsh do. She walked over, waited until he'd finished the stitch. Dr. Hargrove. He glanced at her, irritated at the interruption. Dr. Walsh, did you know she was Navy? His expression shifted slightly. What? Combat surgeon, 8 years active duty. She served on hospital ships. Weena held up her phone, showing him the photo. Hargrove stared at it. His face went carefully blank. The way faces do when someone realizes they've made a significant miscalculation. I need to make a call, he said quietly. Avery was reading about advances in minimally invasive thoracic procedures when her phone rang. Unknown number. She stared at it for 3 rings before answering. Dr. Walsh. Dr. Walsh, this is Captain Rebecca Thorne, Naval Medical Corps. We have a situation. The voice hit her like cold water. Professional, clipped. Familiar in a way that made her chest tighten. She hadn't heard that voice in 18 months, not since she'd signed her resignation papers and walked away from everything that voice represented. Captain. Her own voice came out flat, controlled. There's been an explosion at Naval Air Station Rainier. Trading accident, shipboard fire. 12 casualties, 3 critical. We have shrapnel injuries with vascular compromise. Our trauma team is deployed overseas and the base hospital doesn't have the surgical capacity. Avery stood, moved to the window, looked out at the ocean without seeing it. You're the newest qualified surgeon, Thorne continued. We need you. I'm not active duty, Captain, and I'm currently suspended from surgical privileges. I'm aware of both facts. I'm asking as a courtesy before I make it in order. Something sharp flared in Avery's chest. Anger, maybe. Or the old instinct to snap to attention and say yes, ma'am, without question. You can't order me. I'm civilian now. The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds. Then Thorne's voice came back quieter, more personal. Avery, I know Kandahar still weighs on you. I know why you left, but these are our people. 18 and 19-year-old kids with metal in their chests. And you're the only person within 200 miles who's seen these injuries before, who knows how to extract shrapnel from major vessels without killing the patient in the process. Avery's free hand gripped the window frame. Her knuckles went white. I'm not that surgeon anymore. Then those kids are going to die because you're hiding from what happened. The words hit like a physical blow. Avery closed her eyes, jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. You don't get to say that to me. You weren't there. You didn't see. You're right, I wasn't there. But I read the reports, all of them, including the classified ones, and I know what really happened. It doesn't matter what really happened. The outcome is the same. Avery, she ended the call, pressed the button and set the phone down on the table with exaggerated care, as if it might detonate. Then she stood there, breathing, her whole body rigid with the effort of not throwing something or screaming or letting the memories flood in the way they wanted to. Her hands were shaking, first time in months. She stared at them, willing them steady, watching the fine tremor in her fingers that betrayed everything she tried to keep buried. The phone rang again. She didn't pick it up. Let it ring through to voicemail. Silence returned. She counted her breaths. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. Combat breathing, they'd called it. The thing you did when the world was ending and you needed to function anyway. The phone rang a 3rd time, different number. She recognized it. St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital. Hargrove's direct line. She answered, Dr. Walsh. His voice was different than yesterday. Less authoritative, more uncertain. I just received a rather unusual call from a Navy captain. She says you have specialized training. I'm suspended, Dr. Hargrove. She mentioned that. She also said people will die without you, specifically, that you're the only surgeon in the region with the experience to handle combat shrapnel injuries near major vessels. He paused. Is that true? Avery looked at her hands. They'd stopped shaking. Possibly. She's requesting federal override of your suspension. I told her I'd need to speak with you first. Another pause. Longer this time. Why didn't you tell me you were military? You didn't ask. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. She heard him exhale on the other end, a sound of frustration mixed with something else. Regret, maybe. If I reinstate you for this emergency, will you follow their command structure? Will you work within the system this time? I'll do what the patients need. Dr. Walsh, that's not. I know what you want me to say, that I'll defer to authority, follow protocols, check all the boxes. But we both know that's not why they're calling me. They're calling because when protocols fail and authority doesn't know what to do, I'm the one who can still save the patient. Her voice was quiet but absolute. So no, I won't promise to follow the system. I'll promise to keep people alive. If that's not good enough, tell Captain Thorne to find someone else. There is no one else. That's the point. Then you have your answer. She ended the call before he could respond. The apartment felt too small suddenly, walls pressing in. She grabbed her running shoes, laced them with quick, efficient movements, and headed for the door. Needed to move, needed air, needed to outrun the choice that was crystallizing in her mind, whether she wanted it to or not. The beach was emptier now, mid-morning lull between the dawn runners and the lunch-hour walkers. She ran hard, pushing her pace past sustainable, feeling her lungs burn and her legs protest. Pain was clean. Pain was simple. Pain didn't ask you to revisit trauma or make impossible choices or be someone you'd spent 18 months trying to stop being. Kandahar. The memory forced its way in despite her efforts. Healed hospital. Temporary structure with reinforced walls and generators running constantly in the background. She'd been 3 hours into surgery on a child, a girl maybe 7 years old, caught in crossfire during a raid on a suspected insurgent compound. Abdominal injuries, multiple perforations, bleeding they barely controlled. Avery had been wrist-deep in the repair when the commander had burst in, ordered immediate evacuation, incoming mortar fire, everyone out in 5 minutes. She'd refused. The girl would die if moved, would die if the surgery wasn't completed. 5 minutes wasn't enough. The commander had made it an order. She'd ignored it, kept operating while the building shook, while people shouted, while the world outside descended into chaos. Kept her hands steady and her mind focused, because that's what the patient needed. The power had failed 2 minutes later. Emergency generators should have kicked in. They didn't. The girl had died in the dark, while Avery worked frantically with a headlamp, trying to control bleeding she could barely see. The official report had blamed her, disobeying direct orders, endangering personnel, exercising poor judgment under pressure. She'd been cleared of formal charges, but the message was unmistakable. Her career was over. She'd resigned 3 weeks later, and she'd believed it was her fault. Believed she'd let pride or stubbornness or some misguided hero complex override good sense. Believed she'd killed that child through arrogance. Avery stopped running, bent forward, hands on her knees, breathing hard. The ocean crashed against the shore 30 yards away, rhythmic and indifferent. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Text message. Unknown number, but she knew who it was. Generator failure was sabotage. Insider threat. You were scapegoated to protect ongoing investigation. After-action report declassified last month. You were right to stay. She died because of betrayal, not your choice. Thorne. Avery read it twice, then a third time. 3 years. 3 years of carrying guilt for a failure that wasn't hers. 3 years of believing she'd made the wrong call when she'd made the only call that gave that child any chance at all. She looked up at the sky. Gray clouds breaking apart, blue showing through in patches. The sound of rotor blades came from the north, distant but growing closer. The helicopter materialized through the breaking clouds like something conjured, military gray against pale sky. The distinctive shape of a Navy MH-60S Seahawk, configured for medical transport. The sound grew from distant thunder to overwhelming presence. Rotor wash whipping sand and beach grass into spirals as it descended toward the empty stretch of beach 50 yards from where Avery stood. She didn't move, just watched it come, her hair whipping across her face, her running clothes pressed flat against her body by the downwash. The landing gear touched sand, and the rotors began to slow, but didn't stop, the pilot keeping them hot for immediate departure. The side door opened. Captain Rebecca Thorne stepped out, dress khakis immaculate despite the wind, her expression carved from stone and urgency. She was 48, gray threading through dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. 26 years in the service, and every one of them visible in the way she carried herself. She'd commanded the surgical unit on the Mercy during Avery's last deployment, had written the recommendation that earned Avery her promotion to lieutenant commander, had been the one person Avery trusted without question in a world built on chain of command. Thorne walked toward her across the sand, closing the distance with quick, purposeful strides. She had to shout to be heard over the rotors. "I didn't want to do this." Avery straightened, her own voice rising to match the noise. "I said no." "You don't get to say no." Thorne stopped 3 feet away, close enough that Avery could see the exhaustion around her eyes, the tension in her jaw. "Not when you're the only one who can do this." Thorne pulled a tablet from under her arm. Tapped the screen, turned it toward Avery. Video feed, grainy but clear enough. A trauma bay somewhere, probably the base hospital. A young man on the table, pale, too pale, blood-soaked bandages on his chest. Medics working around him with the controlled panic of people fighting a battle they're losing. Monitor displays visible in the background. Vital signs trending in the wrong direction. "His name is James Kellerman," Thorne said. 19 years old. Explosion severed his subclavian artery. Fragments lodged against the vessel wall. One wrong move, and he exsanguinates in seconds. She looked up from the screen. "You've done this surgery 40 times. Our base surgeon has done it twice, and both patients died." Avery stared at the screen, her clinical mind engaged automatically, cataloging details, processing information, building a surgical approach before she consciously decided to. The fragment position, the angle of entry, the proximity to the thoracic inlet, the blood loss already sustained. "He needs vascular clamps and a bypass graft," she heard herself say, voice shifting into the clipped professional tone that came from years of briefing surgical plans in crisis conditions. "The fragment has to be extracted posterior to the vessel to avoid additional tearing. If there's arterial damage beyond the compression point, he'll need an interposition graft. Probably synthetic given the contamination risk from the explosion." Thorne nodded slowly. "I know. So do you. And so does he, if you get there in time." Avery looked past the tablet at the helicopter, then at the ocean, then back at the screen where a 19-year-old was bleeding out in real time. "If I do this," she said quietly, "it doesn't mean I'm coming back. To the Navy. To any of it." "I'm not asking you to." Thorne's voice gentled slightly. The commander giving way to the person underneath. "I'm asking you to save his life, right now. That's all." "How long do I have?" 12 minutes by air. Maybe less if he deteriorates further. Avery felt the old machinery engage inside her chest, gears and wheels that had been sitting idle for 18 months, suddenly spinning back to operational speed. The calculation was simple. A life measured against her fear, against her determination to stay hidden. Against all the reasons she'd walked away, it wasn't really a choice at all. She started walking toward the helicopter. Thorne fell into step beside her, relief visible in the slight relaxation of her shoulders, even as her pace remained urgent. They reached the aircraft and Avery climbed in, taking one of the seats along the bulkhead. The interior smelled like fuel and metal, and the particular antiseptic scent of medical equipment. A flight medic sat across from her, young, maybe 25, watching her with obvious curiosity. Thorne climbed in behind her, pulled the door closed, signaled the pilot. The rotors increased pitch, and the helicopter lifted, sand swirling below them as they rose above the beach and turned north. Across town, at St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital, Marcus Reeves stood at the nurse's station with his radio, silent on his belt, and his personal phone in his hand. He'd made 3 calls in the last 10 minutes. One to the base hospital, confirming the situation. One to Captain Thorne's office, where he'd gotten voicemail. One to his supervisor, informing him he was taking emergency leave. Now he stood in the ER, watching the organized chaos around him, and waiting for someone to notice what he'd figured out. It took another 2 minutes. Lena emerged from trauma bay, carrying an armful of used supply packaging, heading for the disposal unit. She saw Marcus, and changed direction. "Did you reach her?" "No, but the Navy did." He gestured toward the windows facing north. "Helicopter lifted off from the beach 20 minutes ago." Lena's eyes widened. "They actually sent a helicopter?" For someone like her. Someone with that level of combat trauma experience. Marcus nodded. "They'd send a carrier if they had to." "Does Hargrove know?" "Not yet." As if summoned by his name, Dr. Hargrove appeared from his office, moving quickly toward them. His expression was complicated, somewhere between concern and confusion, and something that might have been embarrassment. Marcus, Dr. Okoye. He looked between them. Have either of you been in contact with Dr. Walsh? No, sir, Lena said. But don't we know the Navy requested her for an emergency at the base? Hargrove's jaw tightened. I just spoke with Captain Thorne again. She informed me they've retrieved Dr. Walsh and are in transit. She also informed me that Dr. Walsh is being temporarily reinstated under federal authority, which supersedes my suspension. He paused, clearly uncomfortable with what came next. She also suggested I review Dr. Walsh's military service record, which she's authorized to be released to me. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, began reading. His expression changed gradually as he scrolled, moving from administrative neutrality to something closer to shock. 8 years active duty, 6 deployments, 3 to the Mercy, 2 to forward surgical teams in Afghanistan, 1 classified assignment. His voice dropped slightly. Over 800 combat surgeries, specialty certifications in thoracic trauma, vascular repair, and emergency resuscitation. Commendations for surgical excellence under fire. He looked up. She operated in war zones, under mortar fire, on aircraft carriers and in field hospitals. Lena said nothing, just watched him process it. I suspended her for performing an unauthorized thoracotomy, Hargrove continued, almost to himself. A procedure she's probably done hundreds of times in conditions that make our ER look like a resort. Marcus cleared his throat. Sir, if I may, I served with Commander Walsh on the Mercy. I was a junior corpsman, mostly post-op care, but I watched her work. She was the best trauma surgeon on that ship, maybe the best I've ever seen. And when I say she was calm under pressure, I mean she operated during a direct attack on our position. Incoming fire, alarms screaming, half the staff evacuating. She stayed at the table and finished the surgery, saved the patient's life. Hargrove looked at him. Why didn't she tell me this? Why hide that level of experience? Because maybe she was trying to leave it behind, Lena said quietly. Maybe she didn't want to be that person anymore. Subscribe to see what happens when the past refuses to stay buried, and the only way forward is through. Comment below and tell us, would you go back to something that broke you if it meant saving lives? The helicopter interior vibrated with mechanical rhythm, the steady thrum of rotors mixing with engine noise into something almost meditative if you'd heard it enough times. Avery had heard it hundreds of times. She sat strapped into the seat with her hands resting on her thighs, eyes closed, breathing measured. To anyone watching, she looked calm, centered, ready. Inside her chest, her heart hammered against her ribs. Thorne sat across from her, tablet balanced on her knee, reviewing patient files and casualty reports. After 3 minutes of silence, she leaned forward and handed Avery a flight suit and the medical brief. 3 critical, 9 stable. James Kellerman is priority 1. Fragment near subclavian artery, suspected arterial nick, BP dropping consistently. He's been stable enough to wait for you, but that window is closing. Avery took the documents, scanned them with the practiced speed of someone who'd read countless pre-op briefs under time pressure. Her eyes moved across vital signs, injury descriptions, preliminary assessments. Her brain automatically sorted them into surgical priority, estimated procedure times, anticipated complications. I need a vascular instrument set, 40 Prolene sutures, cell saver if they have it operational, and 2 units O-negative on standby for Kellerman. The second critical patient, Rodriguez, has chest trauma with possible pneumothorax. I'll need a chest tube kit ready. The third, she paused, reading closer. Henderson has abdominal injuries, could be simple or could be catastrophic, depending on what's bleeding. I'll need imaging before I open him up. Thorne was already on the radio, relaying requirements to the base hospital. Her voice carried the absolute authority of someone who'd spent 2 decades managing crisis medicine. Avery pulled on the flight suit over her running clothes, zipped it up, and secured the Velcro closures with automatic movements. The fabric felt familiar in a way that made her throat tight. She'd worn this uniform, or ones like it, for 8 years. Had shed it intentionally when she resigned, choosing civilian clothes like choosing a new identity. Now here she was, wearing it again. Avery. Thorne's voice was quieter now, the radio communication finished. Kandahar. What I told you in the text message. It's all true. The generator failure was sabotage. An inside operative trying to destroy evidence of weapons trafficking. Your patient died because someone cut the backup power, not because you stayed to finish surgery. Avery opened her eyes but didn't look at Thorne, stared instead at the helicopter's interior bulkhead, at the medical supply cabinets and emergency equipment mounted there. Why didn't you tell me before, when it happened? It was classified. The investigation was ongoing. Highly sensitive. Command made the decision to blame the surgical team to protect the operation. You were collateral damage. Thorne's voice carried weight, regret, something close to anger. I fought it. For what that's worth. I told them you'd made the right call, that any competent surgeon would have done the same. They didn't care. So they let me think I killed a child through arrogance. Yes, the word hung between them, simple and brutal. Avery finally looked at her. Did you know the whole time? I knew there was more to it. I didn't know the details until the declassification last month. As soon as I found out, I tried to reach you. You changed your number, moved, dropped off every military network. Thorne met her eyes. You did, Sapiered. I didn't disappear. I just stopped being Lieutenant Commander Walsh. And became what instead? A junior attending who hides her skills so she doesn't have to remember where she learned them? The words stung because they were accurate. Avery looked away. I couldn't keep operating with that weight on me, she said quietly. Every time I made a decision, every time I had to choose between protocol and instinct, I'd think about that girl. About whether I was being a good surgeon or just being stubborn. It paralyzed me. And now I know the truth. Doesn't change what happened, doesn't bring her back. No, Thorne agreed, but it changes what it means. You didn't fail her, Avery. You fought for her until the moment you physically couldn't anymore. That's not failure. That's what we're supposed to do. The helicopter banked slightly, beginning its descent. Through the window, Avery could see Naval Air Station Rainier spreading below them, buildings and runways and the gray shapes of ships at dock. The base hospital was visible, a low cluster of structures with a red cross painted on the roof. Are you ready? Thorne asked. Avery thought about the question. Ready to walk back into military medicine. Ready to operate in the environment she'd sworn to leave behind. Ready to be the surgeon she'd been before everything collapsed. I don't know if ready is the right word. What word would you use? Avery watched the ground rising toward them, the helicopter's shadow visible below, growing larger as they descended. Necessary. The helicopter touched down on the pad adjacent to the hospital. Before the wheels fully settled, Avery had her harness off and was moving toward the door. The flight medic opened it, and she jumped out, Thorne right behind her. The rotor wash whipped her borrowed flight suit. The noise overwhelming, and then she was clear and moving toward the hospital entrance, where a man in surgical scrubs stood waiting. Lieutenant Davis, 29 years old according to the brief. Base hospital trauma surgeon, 3 years out of residency, suddenly facing casualties beyond his training. He looked exhausted and terrified and grateful in equal measure. Commander Walsh? He had to shout slightly over the diminishing helicopter noise. Just Walsh now. Show me Kellerman. They moved inside, the automatic doors closing behind them and cutting off the external sound. The hospital corridor was organized chaos, staff moving between rooms, equipment carts in motion, the controlled urgency of a facility pushed past its normal capacity. The smell hit her immediately, antiseptic and blood and the particular metallic scent of traumatic injury. Davis led them quickly through the corridor, to the trauma wing. He's in Bay 2. We've maintained pressure on the wound site and kept him sedated. Vitals have been declining slowly for the last hour. BP is 80/50, heart rate 130. Avery processed the information as they walked. Blood loss estimate? At least 2 liters, possibly more internal that we can't quantify. Transfusion? 2 units, no response to volume resuscitation, which meant active bleeding, meant the fragment was doing more than just compressing the artery, meant surgery couldn't wait. They reached Bay 2. Avery stepped inside and everything else fell away. James Kellerman lay on the trauma table, 19 years old, pale as paper, chest wrapped in blood-soaked bandages. Monitors beeped steady rhythms that were deceiving in their regularity, because the numbers they displayed told a different story. A nurse stood at his side, maintaining manual pressure. Another nurse monitored the IV lines. Avery moved to the table, her eyes scanning the patient with clinical precision. She pulled back the bandage edge carefully, examined the wound, assessed the bleeding pattern. How long since injury? 3 hours and 20 minutes. She nodded, still examining. Her hands moved with absolute confidence now, the hesitation from earlier completely absent. This was familiar territory. This was what she'd been trained for across 8 years and hundreds of surgeries. "I've never done this extraction," Davis said quietly behind her. "The last 2 we attempted, we lost both patients on the table." Avery looked at him, saw the fear there, the weight of previous failures. "You won't lose this one," she said. Not arrogance, statement of fact. "I need him prepped for surgery immediately, full vascular setup, and I need complete silence in the operating room once we begin the extraction. No one moves, no one speaks unless I ask a direct question. Understood?" Davis nodded. "Then, let's get him to the OR." The operating room was smaller than she was accustomed to, configured for routine procedures rather than combat trauma, but the essentials were present. Surgical lights overhead casting their shadowless illumination. Instrument trays arranged with sterile precision. Monitoring equipment displaying vital signs in steady digital readouts. The anesthesiologist, a lieutenant commander named Park, stood ready at the head of the table. Avery scrubbed at the sink outside the OR, methodical and thorough, watching through the window as the team positioned Kellerman and completed final preparations. Her hands moved through the familiar ritual, soap and water and the particular angle of friction that removed every potential contaminant. She'd done this thousands of times. The muscle memory ran deeper than thought. Thorne appeared beside her, already gowned, prepared to assist. "Like old times," Thorne said quietly. "We were better equipped on the Mercy. We also had rockets landing 100 yards away. I'll take limited equipment over active combat." Avery almost smiled. Almost. She finished. De-scrubbing, backed through the OR doors, and let the nurses gown and glove her with practiced efficiency. The sterile fabric settled over her flight suit. The gloves snapped into place. She stepped to the table and everything else disappeared. James Kellerman lay exposed under the lights, his chest prepped and draped, the wound site visible where they'd removed the temporary dressings. The fragment was visible on the imaging displayed on the screen to her right. A jagged piece of metal lodged against the subclavian artery like a blade held to a throat. Scalpel. The instrument touched her palm with familiar weight. She made the first incision, clean and confident, extending the existing wound to provide adequate access. Blood welled immediately, but not catastrophically. She'd expected that. Retractor. The assistant placed it. She positioned it precisely, creating a window into the surgical field. Suction. The blood cleared, and she could see the anatomy now, the intricate architecture of vessels and nerves and tissue. The fragment was visible, embedded in the anterior scalene muscle, its tip pressed against the arterial wall with pressure that had compressed but not yet fully penetrated. "I can see the fragment," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It's in contact with the subclavian artery, approximately 2 centimeters distal to the vertebral artery branch point. The vessel wall appears intact, but compromised. I'm going to need proximal and distal vascular control before I attempt extraction." She worked carefully, dissecting through tissue layers with delicate precision, exposing the artery above and below the fragment. Her movements were economical, no wasted motion, every action purposeful and exact. This was the part of surgery that couldn't be taught from textbooks. The spatial awareness and tactile sensitivity that came only from experience. Small Richardson retracte. It appeared in her hand. She positioned it, creating better visualization. DeBakey forceps. She used them to gently mobilize the artery, assessing the damage, confirming her approach. The fragment had created a small arterial wall injury, not yet a full perforation but close. One wrong movement and it would tear through completely. "I need vessel loops for proximal and distal control." Davis passed them and she placed them with absolute precision, looping them around the artery above and below the injury site. Insurance. If the vessel tore during extraction, she could tighten the loops and prevent exsanguination while she repaired the damage. "Vascular clamps ready?" "Ready," Davis confirmed. She could feel the attention in the room, everyone watching. The weight of previous failures pressing down on the surgical team. She pushed it away. Other people's fear wasn't useful. Only the anatomy mattered. Only the patient mattered. "I'm placing the clamps now." She positioned them carefully, occluding blood flow above and below the fragment. The artery between the clamps paled slightly, blood evacuated from that segment. Now she had a controlled field. Now she could work. Extracting the fragment, she gripped it with forceps. Feeling the resistance, the way it was embedded in tissue and pressed against the vessel, she couldn't just pull, had to ease it out, rotating slightly to follow the entry angle, applying steady pressure without jerking or forcing. The fragment began to move. The monitor alarm shrieked, blood pressure dropping precipitously. "We're losing him," someone said, panic edging into their voice. "No," Avery's voice cut through the rising tension like a blade. "Absolute, final. We're not." She continued the extraction, steady and controlled, ignoring the alarms, ignoring the vital signs, her entire focus narrowed to the millimeters of tissue under her hands. The fragment cleared the muscle, cleared the vessel wall, came free. Blood welled into the surgical field, arterial blood under pressure, bright red and pulsing. Suction, 40 proline. Her left hand compressed the bleeding point, while her right took the needle driver. She placed the first suture with absolute precision, catching the arterial wall edges, approximating them, tying the knot with practiced speed. Second suture, third, fourth. Her hands moved like she was playing an invisible instrument, each motion flowing into the next, without pause. The bleeding slowed, stopped, releasing distal clamp. She loosened it carefully. Blood flowed past the repair site. The suture line held, releasing proximal. Full arterial pressure returned. The repair remained intact. Check distal pulse. A nurse at Kellerman's wrist felt for the radial pulse, strong and regular. Avery watched the monitor, blood pressure stabilizing, heart rate coming down, the color returning to Kellerman's face as adequate perfusion resumed. She'd forgotten this feeling, the moment when everything balanced on the edge between life and death, and then tipped toward life because of what your hands had done, the weight of it. The strange lightness that followed. "Closing," she said quietly. She worked through the layers methodically, restoring anatomy, ensuring hemostasis, placing sutures with the same precision she'd used for the arterial repair. When she finished, the wound was closed cleanly, minimal tissue trauma, optimal healing conditions. She stepped back from the table, stripped her gloves. The room was silent, except for the steady beep of the monitors showing stable vital signs. Lieutenant Davis stared at her. "That was extraordinary. I've never seen anyone work that fast with that level of control. He'll need monitoring for 48 hours. Watch for hematoma formation or signs of arterial insufficiency. But the repair is solid. He's going to recover full." "Yes, Park," the anesthesiologist was lightening the sedation. Kellerman's eyes fluttered, consciousness returning gradually. His gaze found Avery, unfocused but aware. "Did it work?" His voice was barely audible, slurred with medication. Avery moved closer, looked down at him. Something in her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You're going to be fine, sailor. Rest now." He managed a weak smile before drifting back under. Above the OR, in the observation gallery, Captain Thorne stood with the base commander and senior medical staff. They'd watched the entire procedure in silence. The base commander, Captain Morrison, turned to Thorne. "Who is she?" "The best combat trauma surgeon I ever commanded," Thorne said, "and probably the best you'll ever see." "Why isn't she still active duty?" "Because we failed her. Let her take the blame for something that wasn't her fault. She resigned, rather than keep serving in a system that betrayed her." Morrison was quiet for a moment, watching through the glass as Avery moved to scrub out. "Can we get her back?" "I don't know. But after today, maybe she'll remember why she became a surgeon in the first place." In the OR, Avery was already reviewing the next patient's file. Rodriguez, the sailor with chest trauma. 9 more patients waiting. The night was far from over. She looked at Davis. "How fast can we turn over this room for the next case?" 15 minutes. Make it 10. "We have work to do." Davis nodded, something like awe visible in his expression, and began directing the team. Avery walked out to scrub again, her movements automatic, her mind already building the surgical approach for the next procedure. This was who she was. Not the quiet attending trying to disappear into civilian medicine. Not the person hiding from her past. This, the surgeon who didn't stop when everyone else had given up, who saw what needed to be done and did it, regardless of cost or consequence or fear. She'd forgotten, but her hands remembered. The sun was rising when Avery finished with the last patient. 12 sailors, 12 surgeries completed across 9 hours of continuous operating. Her feet ached, her back protested from standing, her hands felt heavy with exhaustion. But all 12 patients were stable, alive, with good prognoses for full recovery. She stood at the scrub sink, rinsing her hands one final time. Watching pink-tinged water spiral down the drain. Through the window, she could see the recovery ward, where nurses monitored the post-op patients, where vital signs beeped in steady, reassuring rhythms, where young men who'd been dying hours ago now breathed easily in medicated sleep. Captain Thorne found her there. "The helicopter is ready when you are. I can have you back at St. Catherine's in 15 minutes. Avery dried her hands slowly, methodically. "What happens now? Now you go home, rest, return to your life." Thorne paused. "Or you consider coming back?" "To the Navy, yes." Avery set down the towel. "I can't go back to the way things were, Rebecca. I can't serve in a system that sacrificed me to protect an operation. The people responsible for that decision are no longer in command. New leadership, new priorities. And your record has been corrected. Full exoneration, formal apology on file, though it remains classified." Thorne's voice was careful, not pushing, just presenting facts. "You'd have your choice of assignments. Bethesda, San Diego, back to the Mercy if you wanted. Or you could help establish a new combat trauma training program. Teach the next generation of surgeons what you know. You're offering me everything I walked away from. I'm offering you a chance to do what you're clearly meant to do, without the weight of false guilt." Avery looked out the window again. In one of the recovery beds, James Kellerman slept peacefully, chest rising and falling with easy breaths, monitors showing strong vitals. 19 years old with his whole life ahead of him, because someone had been there who knew how to save him. "I need time to think." Of course. The helicopter flight back to the coast was quiet. Avery sat with her eyes closed, not sleeping, just existing in the space between what she'd been and what she might become. When they landed on the same stretch of beach where they'd departed, the morning was bright and clear, fog burned away by sunshine. Thorne walked with her away from the helicopter. "Whatever you decide, Avery, you should know that what you did last night saved 12 lives. 12 families who won't get devastating phone calls. 12 sailors who go on to have careers and relationships and futures. That matters. I know. Does it change anything?" Avery considered. "I don't know yet." They stood there for a moment, two women who'd served together through deployments and crises, who'd seen the best and worst of military medicine, connected by shared history and fundamentally different choices about what came next. "Thank you for coming when I called," Thorne said finally. "Thank you for telling me the truth about Kandahar." Thorne nodded, then walked back to the helicopter. Avery watched it lift off, watched it turn and head north. Watched until it disappeared into the bright morning sky. Then she walked home. St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital on Monday morning looked exactly as it had before the suspension. Before the helicopter. Before everything. Same fluorescent corridors, same organized chaos of the ER, same smell of antiseptic and coffee and human anxiety. But something had shifted in the way people looked at Avery when she walked in. Nurses who'd barely acknowledged her before nodded respectfully. Residents who'd considered her competent but unremarkable now watched her with obvious curiosity. Word had spread the way word always did in hospitals, about the Navy helicopter and the emergency surgeries and the military service she'd never mentioned. Lena intercepted her before she reached the locker room. "You're back." "I'm back." "You're also trending on medical Twitter." Someone leaked that a suspended ER doctor was retrieved by military helicopter for emergency trauma surgery. Lena held up her phone, showing the feed. "People are calling you a hero." "I'm not a hero. I'm a surgeon who did her job. A job you're apparently exceptionally qualified for and have been hiding from everyone here." Lena's tone wasn't accusatory, just observant. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Because I wanted to be someone else. Someone who didn't carry combat surgery and failed missions and 3 years of misplaced guilt." And now? Avery thought about Kellerman's face when he woke up, about the 12 patients breathing in recovery beds, about her hands remembering skills she'd tried to forget. "Now I'm not sure who I'm supposed to be." Dr. Hargrove's office door was open. He stood when she appeared in the doorway. "Dr. Walsh, please, come in." She entered, closed the door behind her, stood with the same neutral posture she'd maintained during the suspension conversation days earlier, though everything between then and now had fundamentally changed. I owe you an apology, Hargrove said without preamble. Several apologies, actually. I made assumptions about your capabilities based on limited information and bureaucratic thinking. I suspended you for demonstrating exactly the kind of clinical judgment and technical skill we should be encouraging. You followed protocol. That's your job. My job is to provide the best possible care for patients, and I prevented you from doing that because I was more concerned with liability than lives. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Please, sit. She sat. He remained standing, which felt deliberate, like he was the one being evaluated now rather than her. Captain Thorne sent me your complete service record. With your permission, obviously. 8 years of exemplary service, commendations for surgical excellence, training and experience that exceeds most civilian trauma surgeons. He paused. Why work as a junior attending? Why not apply for trauma surgery positions where your skills would be fully utilized? Because I was trying to do simple medicine. Sutures and splints and straightforward cases that didn't require life or death decisions every hour. But that's not who you are. The statement hung between them. Avery looked at him steadily. No, it's not. Hargrove sat down finally, folded his hands on the desk. I'd like to offer you head of trauma surgery. Full surgical privileges. Attending rank, autonomous decision-making authority. You'd report directly to me. But within the trauma department, you'd have complete operational control. That's a significant offer. You're a significant surgeon. What happened at the naval base proved that beyond any question. He leaned forward slightly. I want doctors who make the hard calls, who trust their training and instincts when protocols don't cover the situation in front of them. You've demonstrated that capacity consistently, and I was wrong to penalize you for it. Avery was silent, processing. This was everything she'd needed to hear 3 days ago. Validation, trust, autonomy, permission to be fully herself in her work. I need one thing, she said finally. Name it. If I make a call that contradicts protocol, I need your trust that I had good reason. I'll explain afterward. I'll document everything. I'll take responsibility for outcomes. But in the moment, when a patient's life depends on immediate action, I need to know you won't second-guess me. Hargrove considered this carefully. What she was asking for was substantial, potentially dangerous from a liability perspective, completely contrary to the careful administrative approach he'd built his career on. That's a lot of trust. Yes, it is. And if you're wrong, if a patient dies because of a decision you made against protocol, then I'll answer for it. But my decisions will be based on the best available information and my assessment of what gives the patient a highest chance of survival. Sometimes that means breaking rules that weren't written for the specific situation in front of us. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he extended his hand across the desk. Welcome to St. Catherine's Trauma Surgery Department, Dr. Walsh. I look forward to seeing what you can build here. She shook his hand. Outside his office, Lena was waiting with poorly concealed curiosity. Well, I'm head of trauma surgery. Lena's face lit up. That's incredible. Congratulations. Thank you. So does this mean you'll actually teach us now? Stop hiding what you know and show us how you do what you do? Avery looked at her, this bright young resident with her whole career ahead of her, eager to learn from someone who'd finally stopped pretending to be less than she was. Yes, we start tomorrow. And Lena, what I'm going to teach you isn't just about technique. It's about decision-making under impossible pressure, about trusting yourself when everyone else doubts, about knowing when to follow rules and when to break them to save a life. I'm ready. We'll see. 6 months transformed St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital in ways that went beyond statistics, though the statistics were impressive enough. Trauma survival rates increased by 23%. Average response time for critical interventions dropped by 40%. The emergency department that had been drowning in chaos now operated with the efficient precision of a military surgical unit. So that's exactly what Avery had built. The new trauma simulation lab occupied the entire 3rd floor of the West Wing, funded through a partnership between the hospital and Naval Medical Corps. State-of-the-art equipment, realistic training scenarios, and a curriculum designed by someone who'd learned trauma surgery under mortar fire and taught it under pressure that made simulation seem gentle by comparison. Avery stood at the front of the lab, a mixed group of residents and military medics watching her on screens as she walked through the Kellerman case, frame by frame. The footage came from the base hospital's surgical cameras, every moment of that extraction visible in clinical detail. "The key isn't speed," she said, pausing the video at the moment her hands positioned the vascular clamps. "It's accuracy. You move fast because every motion is correct, not because you're rushing. Speed is a byproduct of precision, not a goal in itself." A second-year resident raised her hand. "How do you maintain that level of control when the patient is actively coding?" "By trusting your training more than your fear. Fear makes you hesitate or rush. Training gives you a pathway through the crisis that doesn't require emotional processing. Your hands know what to do if you let them work." She resumed the video, showing the extraction, the bleeding, the repair. The room watched in silence as the screen displayed what most of them would never see outside this lab: the kind of surgical complexity that ended careers or built legends depending on outcome. When it finished, she opened the floor for questions. They came rapidly, technical and tactical. The questions of people who wanted to understand not just what she'd done, but how to replicate it under their own hands. She answered each one with patience, with detail, with the understanding that teaching wasn't just demonstrating competence, but transferring knowledge in ways that others could absorb and apply. After the session ended and the residents filed out, Lena remained behind. "You're a natural teacher. Have you considered doing this full-time?" Avery was organizing her notes, putting away the teaching materials. "I'm a surgeon first." "You can be both. The Navy's been asking, right? About establishing a national training program?" "They've asked. I haven't answered." Lena watched her carefully. "What's holding you back?" Avery set down the tablet she'd been holding, turned to face Lena directly. "For 3 years, I believed I'd failed as a military surgeon. Believed I'd let pride override judgment and killed a patient because of it. That belief made me walk away from everything I'd worked for." She paused, choosing words carefully. "Now I know the truth. No, I was scapegoated for a command failure, but knowing doesn't erase 3 years of thinking I wasn't good enough. Part of me is still afraid that if I step fully back into this world, I'll discover that fear was justified. After what I've watched you do over the past 6 months, that fear is completely irrational. Most fears are. So what changes it? What makes you believe what everyone else can already see?" Avery smiled slightly. "Time. Repetition. More surgeries where patients live because of what my hands remember how to do." Her office had changed since that first day. The walls now held framed commendations she'd finally unpacked from storage. Photos of patients recovered and healthy, letters of gratitude from families. One photo held prominence on her desk. James Kellerman in dress uniform at his graduation from basic training. Standing with his parents, all 3 of them smiling. The accompanying note was brief. "You gave me my future. I'll spend it honoring that gift. Thank you, Commander. Respectfully, Petty Officer 3rd Class James Kellerman." She'd received similar letters from the other 11 sailors. From Rodriguez, who was back on active duty. From Henderson, who'd gotten married last month. From young men who'd been hours from death and now lived full lives because someone had refused to let statistics and limitations define what was possible. The office phone rang. "Internal line, ER. Dr. Walsh, we have incoming. Mass casualty event, industrial accident at the shipyard. 7 critical patients, multiple blunt force trauma and crush injuries. ETA 4 minutes." Avery was already moving, grabbing her trauma kit from the shelf, heading for the door. "Alert the surgical team. I want all available ORs prepped. Get imaging ready for rapid assessment. And page Dr. Okoye. Tell her this is live training." "Yes, doctor." She moved through the corridor with purpose, other staff members seeing her and immediately shifting into higher gear. Her presence had become synonymous with serious trauma, with cases where the margin between life and death was measured in decisions made and executed with absolute precision. The ER was organized, controlled chaos when she arrived. Residents positioning equipment, nurses preparing bays, everyone moving with the choreographed efficiency that came from training and repetition, and leadership that knew exactly what needed to happen. Lena appeared at her side, already gowned and gloved. 7 critical? At least. Could be more depending on what we find. The first ambulance arrived. Paramedics rushed a gurney through the doors, patient strapped down, obvious chest trauma, face pale, breathing labored. Avery moved to intercept them, assessed the patient in seconds with practiced eyes. Trauma 1. Possible pneumothorax and internal bleeding. Get me a chest X-ray and type and cross for 6 units. Second ambulance. Third. The ER filled with urgent voices and equipment sounds, and the particular organized chaos that Avery had learned to navigate on aircraft carry. Arson and field hospitals that she'd brought here and taught others to move through with confidence rather than panic. She worked between patients, directing care, making rapid assessments, her mind processing information faster than most people could articulate questions. This was what she'd been made for. Not the quiet routine of simple medicine, but this. The edge where skill and nerve and experience combined to pull people back from death. From the observation area above the ER, Dr. Hargrove watched with a colleague from administration. 6 months ago, this would have overwhelmed us completely, the colleague said. 6 months ago, we didn't have her. Hargrove nodded toward where Avery stood directing a difficult intubation with calm, precise instructions. Best decision I ever made was getting out of her way and letting her work. The board wants to expand the trauma program, make it a regional center. Then they should ask Dr. Walsh what she needs and give it to her. Because whatever she asks for, it'll be exactly what's required and nothing more. In Trauma Bay 1, Avery had her hands in a chest cavity, controlling bleeding from a lacerated vessel while a resident watched and learned. Her voice was steady, instructional even in crisis. See how the tissue responds to pressure here? That tells you the vessel wall is intact enough for primary repair. If it felt mushier, you'd need a graft. Always let the anatomy guide your approach. The resident nodded, absorbing information that couldn't be taught from textbooks. By the time the last patient was stabilized and moved to surgery, 3 hours had passed. 7 critical patients, all alive, all with good prognoses. The ER staff moved through cleanup with the satisfied exhaustion of a team that had performed exactly as trained. Avery stripped her gloves, washed her hands, felt the familiar ache in her shoulders and back that came from hours of focused intensity. Her phone vibrated. Text message from Captain Thorne. Humanitarian crisis in the South Pacific. Earthquake. Thousands injured. Overwhelmed local medical infrastructure. Joint military-civilian response team being assembled. Need surgical team leader for 2-week deployment. Interested? Avery read it twice. Looked around the ER at the department she'd built, the people she'd trained, the system that now functioned with excellence because she'd stopped hiding and started leading. She typed her response. Need to clear it with hospital administration, and I'm bringing 2 of my residents for training. If that's acceptable, I'm in. The reply came 30 seconds later. Done. Briefing materials incoming. Thank you, Avery. She pocketed the phone, looked up to find Lena watching her with knowing eyes. Going somewhere? South Pacific, earthquake response, 2 weeks. You and Cooper are coming with me. Lena's face lit up with excitement and something close to awe. Serious? Completely serious. If you're going to learn combat trauma medicine, you need to see it in context. This is that context. When do we leave? 3 days. Start getting your affairs in order. That evening, Avery stood at her apartment window looking out at the ocean, the same view she'd stared at 6 months ago when she'd been trying to outrun her past and failing. Now the past had caught up, integrated itself into her present, stopped being something to escape and become something to build on. Her phone rang. She smiled slightly when she saw the caller ID. Hey James, Commander Walsh, hope I'm not calling too late. Never too late. How's the Navy treating you? Good, really good actually. I'm on a destroyer out of San Diego, engineering division. His voice carried enthusiasm and youth, and the particular gratitude of someone who knew exactly how close they'd come to never having this conversation. I just wanted to thank you again. I know I send the monthly photos, but it doesn't feel like enough for what you did. You don't owe me anything, James. You being alive and serving and having a life, that's all the thanks I need. Still, you gave me everything. My career, my future. Probably my wedding someday if I ever work up the courage to propose to my girlfriend. He laughed. She wants to meet you, by the way. Says anyone who can pull off what you did deserves a thank you in person. Maybe when you're back in port, I'd like that. They talked for a few more minutes about his training, his ship, his plans. When the call ended, Avery set the phone down and returned to the window. 12 lives saved that night at the naval base. 7 more today. Hundreds over the past 6 months, through surgeries and training and building a program that would save thousands more, through the residents she'd taught and the protocols she'd established. This was who she was, not the person hiding from failure, not the person diminished by false guilt, the surgeon who saw what needed to be done and did it, who trusted her hands and her training, and her instinct, even when everyone else doubted. The person who'd stopped running and started building. Her reflection in the window looked back at her, and for the first time in 3 years, she recognized herself completely. Sometimes the past doesn't let you go because you're not meant to escape it. You're meant to understand it, integrate it, transform it into something that serves rather than haunts. Sometimes being suspended is exactly what you need to remember who you really are. And sometimes a Navy helicopter arriving to override that suspension is the universe telling you that some skills are too important to stay buried, some people too valuable to remain hidden, some callings too essential to ignore. Dr. Avery Walsh had finally stopped hiding. The world was better for it.